How could a single teenager, with a quiet voice and a piercing gaze, bring the world to a standstill and become the epicenter of a global movement? Was it a spontaneous awakening of youth consciousness, or one of the most brilliant mass psychology operations ever executed? Welcome to The Truth, Dark Psychology. Here, we don't accept the surface. We dissect the hidden gears that move the most enigmatic figures of our time. If you dare to question what is presented as absolute truth, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and like this video, because today we are going to unravel the complex psychological architecture behind a phenomenon that has defined a generation. Human psyche is deeply susceptible to ancient stories and symbols, and few figures are as powerful as the archetype of the innocent prophet. By placing a young girl at the center of the global stage, the environmental movement activated a primal psychological trigger. The image of the child who sees the truth that corrupt adults ignore is an irresistible narrative. It forces us into a state of discomfort where criticizing the message feels the same as attacking innocence itself. This is a masterful disarmament tactic, which nullifies critical analysis before it can even begin, creating a protective shield around the message. This strategy exploits a fundamental vulnerability in our social programming: the instinct to protect the young. Greta's message, delivered with a seriousness that contrasts with her age, creates a powerful cognitive dissonance. The audience is confronted with the gravity of an adult in a child's body, which amplifies the emotional weight of her words. We are no longer listening to an activist. We are listening to the future personified, accusing us of betrayal. It is a form of emotional control that shifts the debate from a matter of policy to a matter of fundamental morality and generational duty. The use of youth and perceived purity is not just poetic, it is a calculated tool of power. Innocence becomes a weapon that confers an almost unassailable moral authority. Anyone who questions the validity of her argument or the strategy behind her movement risks being labeled a cynic who attacks a child. This creates a formidable defensive barrier, isolating the central figure and her ideas from the rigorous criticism that any large-scale political movement should face. Innocence in this context is not a passive quality. It is an active and manipulative force. Behind the genuine passion that undoubtedly exists, a dark psychological dynamic is at play. The symbol of the child savior allows complex and sometimes extreme messages to be accepted with less scrutiny. It is the personification of the appeal to emotion in its most potent form. The question dark psychology compels us does not whether the cause is just, but whether the use of such a powerful archetype to silence dissent and force emotional compliance is a form of manipulation, regardless of the intentions. Ultimately, the phenomenon teaches us about our own collective desire for a savior. In a complex world full of shades of gray, the figure of a child prophet who speaks in black and white offers a seductive clarity. She becomes a repository for our own hopes and fears, a pure symbol in an impure world. To understand this is to understand that the greatest strength of her movement may not lie in its data or speeches, but in its masterful exploitation of a deep and universal psychological need. Greta Thunberg's language is a masterclass in the power of absolutist communication. Phrases like "our house is on fire" and the infamous "how dare you" are not designed to start a dialogue, but to end one. They establish a rigid moral framework. On one side, virtue and survival. On the other, greed and annihilation. This extreme polarization is a highly effective mass manipulation technique. It eliminates complexity and nuance, forcing individuals to choose a side, and in doing so, to adopt the entire ideology of the movement without question. This type of rhetoric works by activating primitive emotional centers of the brain, such as anger and fear. By framing the climate crisis not as a multifaceted problem with multiple actors and complex solutions, but as a direct betrayal by the older generations, She generates a wave of righteous indignation. This anger is psychologically gratifying for her followers, as it gives them a sense of moral superiority and a clear purpose. They are not just activists. They are soldiers in a holy war for the soul of the planet, and ambiguity is the first casualty of this war. The use of shame as a political tool is another pillar of her influence. By addressing world leaders directly with an accusatory tone, she places them in a psychologically untenable position. Either they agree and submit to her moral authority, or they disagree and are publicly shamed as villains. For the mass audience, this is a captivating David versus Goliath spectacle. However, it is also a form of control that intimidates opposition and pressures for conformity, rather than collaboration based on mutual respect and the complexity of the facts. The inherent danger of this absolutist strategy is the suffocation of critical thinking. When a movement defines itself by an unshakable moral certainty, any voice of moderation or questioning is seen as heresy. Scientists who point out complexities, economists who discuss the costs of transition, and citizens who worry about the impact on their jobs are easily dismissed as deniers or accomplices to evil. Absolutism creates an echo chamber where the purity of the cause justifies hostility against anyone who does not show total loyalty. In essence, the "how dare you" effect reveals a dark truth about human psychology. We often prefer the clarity of war to the complexity of peace. Greta's rhetoric offers this clarity. It provides a clear enemy, a just cause, and a path to personal redemption through activism. It is a powerful formula for mobilization, but its cost is the fragmentation of public discourse and the demonization of those who inhabit the inevitable gray areas of reality. It is inspiration that borders on incitement, the way Greta Thunberg's Asperger's diagnosis has been integrated into her public persona is a masterstroke of psychological branding. What could be perceived as a social barrier was brilliantly reframed as a superpower. This narrative suggests that her condition frees her from social conventions and the need to please, allowing her to see and speak the truth purely and without filters. This transforms her from an activist into a kind of oracle, someone whose neurology makes her immune to the social corruption that affects the rest of us. Psychologically, this characterization creates a powerful sense of authenticity. In an age of distrust in politicians and public figures, who are seen as calculating and fake, Greta emerges as the perfect antidote. Her fixed gaze, her direct speech, and her apparent lack of interest in social subtleties are interpreted not as symptoms of a neurological condition, but as proof of her unwavering honesty. She is not playing the game, and this makes her, in the eyes of the public, the most trustworthy person in the room. This forced authenticity becomes a subtle tool of control. It discourages criticism of her style or delivery, as any attack on these aspects can be easily deflected as an attack on her neurological condition. This creates an additional layer of protection around her, shielding her from the kind of scrutiny over charisma and presentation that other public figures face. The superpower narrative effectively turns a personal characteristic into a tactical shield, neutralizing an entire line of potential criticism. However, there's a complex and dark ethical question here. The instrumentalization of a diagnosis, even with good intentions, risks creating a stereotype and placing immense pressure on other individuals on the autistic spectrum. It turns a diverse and complex neurological condition into a simple trope of pure truth. Dark psychology invites us to question, to what extent does the construction of this public persona exploit a real condition to gain a rhetorical and emotional advantage over the audience and opponents? Ultimately, the transformation of Asperger's into a superpower was crucial in cementing her image as a unique and incorruptible figure. It set her apart from all other activists, giving her a psychological advantage that is almost impossible to replicate or combat directly. The lesson here is about the power of narrative. the ability to take any set of facts, including a medical diagnosis, and weave it into a story of power that captivates the public's imagination and serves a strategic purpose. Greta Thunberg did not create climate anxiety, but she became the perfect vessel for it. Her meteoric rise was only possible because she emerged at a moment of deep collective anguish, especially among young people. She gave a face and a voice to a diffuse and paralyzing fear, turning passive anxiety into directed action. Psychologically, she functions as a point of projection. Onto her, millions of people project their own frustrations, their sense of powerlessness, and their anger against a system that seems indifferent to their future. Asterisk. The movement she leads is a master at leveraging guilt, particularly generational guilt. The prevailing narrative is that of a war between the virtuous youth and the negligent, selfish elders. This conflict framework is psychologically potent because it creates a strong group identity for the young and a clearly defined enemy. For adults, the effect is twofold. Some react with defensiveness, while many others internalize the guilt. This internalized guilt can be a powerful motivator for action, or more cynically, for vocal support of the movement as a form of personal absolution. This dynamic of projection and guilt places an extraordinary psychological burden on a single person. By becoming the avatar of global climate consciousness, Greta absorbs not only the hope, but also the hysteria and dysfunction of an entire system. She becomes a symbol, and symbols are far less flexible than human beings. The pressure to maintain this persona of purity and unshakable moral certainty is immense and can be psychologically draining. The movement, intentionally or not, demands that she sacrifice her individuality for the sake of the symbol she has become. Dark psychology forces us to examine what happens when a movement becomes so heavily dependent on projection onto a single figure. This can lead to a dangerous emotional dependency. Followers may begin to outsource their own agency and responsibility to the leader figure, hoping that her passion and sacrifice will be enough to change the world. It is the creation of an idol, and history repeatedly shows us the dangers of idolatry, even when the cause is noble. Responsibility becomes diluted in worship. Therefore, the Greta Thunberg phenomenon teaches us about the human need to find scapegoats and saviors. She serves both roles simultaneously. She is the savior for her followers and, for her detractors, the scapegoat for everything wrong with modern activism. She is a mirror that reflects our deepest anxieties about the future and our deepest guilt about the present. And the image we see in that mirror is so powerful that we often forget we are looking at a projection of ourselves. We are at the heart of the analysis, and the layers only get more complex. If you're realizing how psychology shapes the world in ways you never imagined, do yourself and the channel a favor. Like this video and subscribe to The Truth, Dark Psychology. What other enigmatic public figure do you want us to dissect? Leave your suggestion in the comments. Now let's dive into the invisible power structure. The narrative of a lone young girl who starts a school strike and organically inspires. The world is poetically powerful, but psychologically naive. A global movement is not born from a vacuum. Behind the Greta Thunberg phenomenon, there is a sophisticated architecture of support, including parents with media experience, veteran climate activists, and public relations professionals. Dark psychology is not interested in invalidating her sincerity, but in exposing the hidden machinery that transforms sincerity into global influence. The lone wolf image is itself the product of a very well-coordinated pack strategy. Maintaining the image of a grassroots movement is crucial for its legitimacy. The public is far more receptive to a cause that appears to spring spontaneously from the people than to a campaign that seems orchestrated by elites. For this reason, the presence and influence of figures like Ingmar Renshug, a marketing and PR expert who helped catapult Greta's story to initial fame, are often downplayed. The perception of authenticity is a strategic asset that must be protected at all costs, even if that protection requires obscuring the truth about the movement's origins. This dynamic reveals a central paradox of modern influence: to appear completely authentic. An extraordinary level of artificiality and backroom planning is often necessary. The choice of words, the curation of the image, the strategic media appearances, all of this is calculated to maximize emotional and psychological impact. The genius of the operation behind Greta lies in its ability to make this immense support structure seem invisible, allowing Greta herself to remain as the pure and seemingly unmediated focus. This teaches us a fundamental lesson about control and power. The most effective power is not that which is openly displayed, but that which operates in the shadows, shaping perceptions without the target even realizing they are being shaped. By creating a powerful symbol like Greta, the architects of the movement can transmit their messages through a channel that is immune to criticism and generates a deep emotional connection with the public. It is a form of narrative control in its highest expression. Therefore, when analyzing the phenomenon, it is a psychological mistake to focus only on the figurehead of the ship. We must look at the engineers in the engine room. Who is funding? Who is advising? Who is amplifying the message, and why? The story of Greta is not that of one girl against the world. It is the story of a faction of the world with significant resources and expertise that found the perfect avatar to wage its cultural and political war, using the psychology of authenticity as its primary weapon. Asterisk: when an individual becomes synonymous with a cause, the lines between support and worship begin to blur, giving rise to a cult of personality. In the case of Greta Thunberg, she has been elevated to a quasi-messianic status by her most fervent followers. In this psychological state, the message and the messenger become inseparable. To criticize a policy proposal of the movement is perceived as a personal attack on Greta, and to question her tactics is seen as a betrayal of the very cause of planetary salvation. This creates a toxic environment for healthy debate. The group dynamics that form around such a polarizing figure are intense. A strong us versus them mentality develops, where us is composed of the enlightened and morally righteous, and them is anyone who expresses skepticism or dissent, who are quickly labeled as enemies of the future. This siege mentality is psychologically comforting for the members of the group, as it strengthens their identity and sense of purpose. But it is extremely dangerous for a democratic society that relies on the exchange of ideas and compromise. Blind devotion to a leader, no matter how noble their cause, is a form of outsourcing one's conscience. Instead of engaging with the overwhelming complexity of a problem, followers find psychological relief in placing their faith in a figure who seems to have all the answers. They follow not because they have been convinced by a rational analysis of all the facts, but because they have been emotionally captivated by the leader's certainty and passion. It is a surrender of individual autonomy in exchange for the safety of the tribe. This type of devotion also makes the movement fragile and inflexible. If the central figure makes a mistake, or if new information requires a change in strategy, the rigid structure of the cult of personality makes adaptation nearly impossible. The leader's infallibility must be maintained at all costs to preserve the group's cohesion. This prevents self-criticism and evolution, which are vital for the long-term success of any serious movement. The cause becomes a hostage to the image of its icon. The dark lesson here is about the seduction of certainty. In times of anxiety and confusion, the temptation to follow someone who offers absolute moral clarity is immense. Greta Thunberg phenomenon shows us how, even in secular and scientific contexts, the human need for prophets and idols remains as strong as ever. It warns us of the danger of allowing our admiration for an individual to blind us to the principles of critical thinking, open-mindedness, and personal responsibility. What is the lasting psychological legacy of the Greta Thunberg phenomenon? On one hand, she has arguably redefined activism for the 21st century, demonstrating the immense power an individual can wield in the age of social media to mobilize millions and set the global agenda. She empowered a generation, showing that age is no barrier to influence and that passion can indeed challenge entrenched power structures. This is the inspiring narrative, the bright side of her impact. However, dark psychology compels us to look at the other side of the coin. The phenomenon can also be seen as a frighteningly effective manual for mass manipulation. It provides a detailed blueprint of how to use psychological archetypes, absolutist rhetoric, the leveraging of guilt, and the construction of a cult of personality to advance an agenda. The methodology can be replicated for any cause, noble or nefarious. The question that remains is whether the ends justify the use of such psychologically coercive means. Asterisk. The deepest impact may be on the health of public discourse. By popularizing a style of activism based on moral condemnation rather than debate, the phenomenon may have contributed to deepening polarization. It has taught a generation that the most effective way to promote change is not through persuasion and compromise, but through shame, public exposure, and the demand for total capitulation. This sets a dangerous precedent for how future ideological battles will be fought, with less room for reason and more for outrage. Asterisk. The final lesson that dark psychology draws from this is about the thin line between inspiration and manipulation. Greta Thunberg and the movement around her have shown us that this line is almost invisible. It is possible to genuinely inspire people while simultaneously employing tactics that manipulate their deepest emotions and psychological vulnerabilities. The sincerity of the central figure does not negate the calculated sophistication of the strategy that surrounds her. Both truths can coexist, and it is in this complexity that true understanding lies. In the end, we are left with an uncomfortable question. In celebrating an icon who made us feel good about a cause, did we surrender our ability to think critically about how power and influence truly work? The legacy of Greta Thunberg may not be about the climate, but about our own susceptibility to the seduction of a well-told story, reminding us that in the theater of public life, the psychological stage, director is often more important than the actor on the stage. The minds that shape our world are labyrinths of light and shadow. Exploring them is the only way to understand the forces that govern us. To ensure you don't miss any of our future investigations into the dark psychology behind power, subscribe now to The Truth, Dark Psychology. Hit the notification bell to be the first to know when the truth is exposed, and leave your final comment. What in this entire psychological architecture surprised you the most? Until next time, asterisk.